And what we discovered, we should have known, and it's common sense. And that's one thing about the book Triggers and Barriers that I wrote. It's all common sense. There's nothing really radical about it. Is if you think deeply, you'd realize that these things are utterly predictable. Is that the way people buy is very common throughout everyone, whether you're an individual or a company. You're buying because you're triggered to buy from something. And there are 4 types of triggers that exist.
Good morning, Charles. Welcome to Waterloo Grit, the podcast. It is fantastic to have you here. I'm pretty sure founders across the ecosystem who listen in on this podcast are eager to check in on this episode to find some fascinating insights about the startup ecosystem from someone like you.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Before we get started, a huge shout out and a big thank you to David Johnston, R&T Park, for supporting this podcast. All right, let's get it on the road. So let's start with you, Charles. I would love for you to describe yourself. What is your personal story, and what brings you to where you are in life?
Oh, no, that's a horrible question to ask. I can't stand sharing my personal story. It just goes on because I never decide what I am. I won't take you all the way back, but I spent 16 years as the co-founder and CEO of a telecom software company. Mm-hmm. And I left that about 20 years ago. And so I can give it some idea as to the fact I've been around this technology business for a while. And when I left, I realized I really didn't know what I was doing. And I'd sort of struggled the whole time. You know, you start a company in the mid 80s and you wonder, well, how do you start a software company? What is a software company? Friends didn't have the faintest idea of what I was doing. So, you know, I spent my time trying to figure out how do you grow a software company. And, I'd learned some things, but didn't learn enough, didn't create a world-class behemoth. And so as I left, I said, well, I still don't know how to create a world-class software company. I better go and find out. So I thought, instead of starting another one, I figured I wouldn't start another one until I actually knew what I was doing. And so I went and tried to work for a few others. And so I ended up a CFO of a couple of them because in the past I actually became an accountant. So that was a natural thing for me to do. And I didn't learn anything that way either. So I tried investment banking for a while. And worked in the technology sphere with technology companies. Didn't find anything out that way. And I spent 4 years at Mars trying to figure it out as well. And didn't run into any firms that became world-class wonders that I could learn from. And this is part of the problem. If you go back from all the way from the 70s to about 2010, we didn't produce many world-class technology companies. We produced BlackBerry and OpenText and one or two large firms. But for the most part, you know, if you weren't in Waterloo, you weren't getting exposed to much of them, particularly in Toronto. So I scratched my head. I tried venture capital. I've been at 3 venture capital firms, but you know, you see little bits of things, but you don't get the whole picture. So I had a while where I got to spend time as a senior fellow in an institute at the University of Toronto, and that was really instructive because I spent my time doing research, or a lot of it. And I've written 1 book and 40 research papers or so, and another book on the way, all the while looking at what does it take to create massive success. And finally, it's just the research started building steam, and I found more and more. And I've gotten to the point where, you know, I'm pretty good at pattern recognition, and I can see the elements of the right things when I now look at a company. And I can examine what they're doing and make recommendations. So I've got a much better idea. Do I have all the answers? Absolutely not. But I feel a lot better than I did 20 years ago. And then I actually can figure out what it takes to some degree. And then as for some reason, people keep wanting to work with me. So, you know, I'm now helping about 7 companies out in their approach to try and become world-class companies using the knowledge that I've gained. And always willing to admit that anything I know could be wrong, and that you know, there's a hell of a lot more I could learn in the process, and I'm eager to do that all the time.
Fantastic. I mean, that in itself is such an enriching journey. Which brings me to the Narwhal Project, right? Number one, it's a fantastic name. Number two,
I didn't come up with it. I stole it from someone with his permission. So I don't take the credit.
but credit where it's due. There's a ton of really interesting material on your site, on the papers, your blog, the book. So let's start off with, what does the Narwhal Project do? What do you stand for? What does the company stand for?
Well, right now we classify ourselves as a stage 2 accelerator. It's a fancy word for helping companies get big by getting capital and figuring all that stuff out. That's one half of what we do. The other half is we still continue to do research to figure out what it takes to be successful in the technology business, and applying the research to the work that we're doing with companies. And we're not a typical accelerator. We work and we don't have intake classes, we don't have courses, we don't have assignments. We actually roll our sleeves up and get down and dirty and work with companies. We work with them to develop their pitch deck, start with figuring out their strategy, and we work at the intersection of strategy, finance, and marketing, essentially, and help companies figure out their strategy, build a pitch deck around that. We do the financial forecasting and make sure the accounting's all done, and work with them to help them find investors, acting most of the time as CFO, although I'm a board chair of about 4 of those clients. So, anything we can do to help advance the cause of a company is it's attempting to go through the early stages of growth, early stages of revenue, etc.
Got it. And that makes a lot of sense. The last part of what you said, the early stage, which is really where companies are either made or they fall apart. And the title of, what you put out there, Triggers and Barriers, is a fascinating way to really distill it down to the 2 things that make entrepreneurs. It would be awesome to hear more about those 2 tenets of entrepreneurship from you.
Yeah, okay. That's an interesting way of asking the question. This all came about, Triggers and Barriers came about because of a company I co-founded a number of years ago. And when I went back and looked at the work I'd done originally at Synamics, one of our biggest difficulties was executing on strategic plans. And I was talking to another friend who'd been an entrepreneur and sold his company, and his problem also was executing on strategic plans. And we were doing some background research and discovered that Harvard Business Review says the biggest problem in business is, executing on strategic plans. So we figured, well, why don't we build some software to help people execute on their strategic plans? I mean, it seems logical. Everybody we talked to had this as a problem, and everybody acknowledged it as a major thing. And so we started this, and we went out to the marketplace, and we absolutely bombed. We didn't get a single order. We had trouble even getting people to talk to us about this as a concept. And what we discovered, we should have known, and it's common sense. And that's one thing about the book Triggers and Barriers that I wrote. It's all common sense. There's nothing really radical about it. If you think deeply, you'd realize that these things are utterly predictable, is that the way people buy is very common throughout everyone. Whether you're an individual or a company, you're buying because you're triggered to buy from something. And there are 4 types of triggers that exist in the world. And we can get into them in a second if you want. But you can't trigger someone to buy. They have to be triggered by something that's changing in their life. And the changes in their life would be operational, like my machine's broken, I need to buy a new one. Regulatory, the government says I need to buy a machine that pollutes less. Strategic, I need to buy a machine so I can beat my competitors. Or financial, I need to buy a machine to save money. So when you look at those are triggers. We can't influence anyone else in their triggers. You're triggered by something happening in your environment. If you're an entrepreneur, you have to respond to those triggers. You have to be there when the company is triggered, and you have to make them aware that you are there, so that when they are triggered, they'll think of you. And it's one of the reasons you see ads for Bell Mobility and Rogers every day, like literally every single day. because every day someone wakes up with a broken phone. And it's only on that day that they wake up with a broken phone that they're going to think about getting a new one.
Right.
Unless, of course, their phone is so old that they can't take proper pictures or their friends are giving them a hard time. But those are all triggers that exist. The barriers are what gets in the way of people making decisions to buy something. And, there's pure sloth. Mm-hmm. Making a decision is hard. Taking the extra effort is hard. So people are slow to adopt new technologies just because barriers stand in the way. So foundation of entrepreneurship is understanding what those triggers are and what barriers exist, because you've got to use the triggers to your advantage and get around the barriers effectively. So that's where a lot of that work came from. And I still use it every day. I come up with the stupidest ideas for businesses, but I can apply a lens now to say, oh, that's a stupid idea because no one's triggered that way.
That's brilliant in the sense that it really distills it down into contextual common sense, right? And if you now take a bit of a glimpse into what the world has seen over the last 2 years, is it fair to state that if you have copious amounts of capital, you'll eventually figure it out as an entrepreneur? So you can pretty much start with those 4 triggers, not necessarily applying themselves to the company being successful, but then you get a big check from, SoftBank's Vision Fund or Sequoia, and you'll eventually figure it out because I guess you're overcoming barriers. Is that a fair statement?
Well, yeah, you can eventually figure clients out, but the problem is if then you're a product in search of a market, and that's really difficult. I've been there too, and that hurts. And you're better off to go find a market than build a product. Find out where people are being triggered. And I think you brought up the pandemic. Look at that as a perfect example of this concept. Bill Gates got up and talked about the pandemic coming a few years ago, and no one did anything.
Right.
We had SARS and MERS, and no one did anything. And all of a sudden, the pandemic happened. Well, that was a big trigger. All of a sudden, regulations came into place. Drugs were developed. The mask business started off. Nobody was making N95. Nobody knew what an N95 mask was 2 years ago, let alone purchase one. Now they have collections of them in their houses. So, there's a good example of what happens in the world. No matter how many times we were warned, we did nothing about the impending pandemic. Rapid antigen testing, that sort of thing. It was a technology that was available that people poo-pooed because it's perceived to be less accurate than PCR testing. It's actually not necessarily that being the case, but so now it's accepted because it's necessary to be able to go about your daily life. You have to have more regular testing. Can't get PCR tests all the time. So, we have shifts in technology that occur. Zoom. Zoom was around. I used Zoom long before the pandemic, but not to the degree that I use it every single day now. And so, Zoom's results with Zooming.
That's so true. In fact, I was half joking, recently about, imagine in 2019, you walk up to your boss and say, hey, listen, I'm going to be Zooming in for the next 1 hour, next 1 year, and hopefully I still have a job. And fast forward now, it is, depending on your job, it is the norm, right? So clearly a macro condition has created or disrupted the ecosystem in a way that a barrier has disappeared, to your earlier point, right? And it's amazing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's amazing how entrepreneurs don't necessarily have control over the situation, but your ability to pivot and to your earlier point, the data is there for all to see, but it's the patterns and the signals that you identify from that common data that I guess potentially makes you an interesting leader with insights that drives the organization in a direction.
Well, what I'm trying to do now, and there's a good follow up to that, because you say, consumers are triggered one way, venture capitalists are triggered as well,
right?
And it's amusing because I'm thinking of 2 clients of mine right now that are trying to raise funding.
Mm-hmm.
And one is a really tremendous company that has got, I think, $90,000 in revenue in January. It's doubled from last year's revenue. So they're really solidly producing. They're getting new distributors all the time, signed a major one in the US that should increase revenue dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
And everything's going right. But they're in an intersection between two technologies that no one's paying attention to and that no one really wants to.
Mm.
The other company has got a couple of trial clients, and they're in the climate space, and the VCs are all over them.
Right.
So it's the comparison between the two. So if you think about it, everybody is triggered. You go back to the .com boom. Anybody who added .com in their company name got investment dollars at the time. And for a few years, the same thing was happening in AI.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's whatever. But there was blockchain, crypto. There are these fads, and these fads, like, well, the pandemic, it's not a fad, but it changes the way people perceive things, and it enables opportunities to exist that didn't exist before.
True. Which is fascinating, right? If you look at entrepreneurs across the world, one of the common themes that often gets discussed is, and you've addressed it quite eloquently in your blog. The question is, how much money do you raise, especially early stage, right? Super early stage, close to product market fit, pre-product market fit, just after product market fit. The intuitive answer is the more you raise, the better off you are, right? You'll figure things out. But at the same time, there's this concept of, it's early stage. Can you maintain discipline? And are you going to dilute yourself too much, etc.? So what would your advice be? Is there something like a suboptimal number that you raise if you're B2C or B2B?
Well, I have to unpack your question because there are umpteen different concepts in that one question, which is a really great question. So I'm going to unpack it a piece at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And the first piece is how much you need to raise.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an interesting one because typically in Canada, we put too little money into companies in the very beginning.
Mm.
But if you can think of it, you normally want to raise funds every 18 to 24 months.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And because if you're raising more often than that, then all you're doing is spending your time raising.
Mm.
And if you're raising every 36 months, then you're not using the funds fast enough. So if you look at the optimal amount to raise, is you've got to get yourself from the point you're at now to the point where you can raise your next round. So let's say you've just got a little bit of traction. So you've got to get from a little bit of traction to a seed round.
Mm.
Well, a seed round, let's call it, you should be doing about $50,000 a month.
Mm-hmm.
So on an annual basis, that might be about $400,000.
Mm-hmm.
If I go and look at other research I've done, it's about $2 of capital to produce $1 of revenue.
Mm.
So that you need about an $800,000 seed round to get to $50,000 a month revenue, which then gets you the ability to raise an A round and, to raise a seed round. So pre-seed to seed. The seed round, you've got to get to $200,000 a month in 2 years, which means that year you might be doing revenue of, 1.2 to 1.5 million.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, the 2 to 1, you need about $3 million of capital.
Mm.
So what happens is if you raise too little, you can't spend enough on sales and marketing, and there's a natural relationship between your spending on sales and marketing and your revenue.
Mm.
So if you can't spend enough on sales and marketing, you end up with slower growth.
Yep.
And when you have slower growth, you get less interest in the company from the next round of funders. Like funders sitting there. Company A's got 200% growth a year. Company B's got 50% growth a year. Which one are you going to invest in?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty simple. Well, the one that got 200,000 was growing 200% a year might have raised 10 million. The other one might have raised 100,000. One's wasting money but has grown, and one has been efficient with money but hasn't grown.
Yep.
The one that has wasted money and grown will be better off than the one who's efficient and not grown as much. So very early on, companies need to raise enough to get to the next stage to be of interest enough for the next stage of funder. Canadians are funded, when they're just funded in Canada by Canadians, maybe 60% of the rate of American funding, which means they don't get to that level, and we create suboptimal growth that continues on through. So that's one part. If you look at unicorns, you can see this. The Canadian unicorns, almost all of them got U.S. money very early on, which meant larger dollars, which propelled their growth. Because the more you get earlier on, the higher your growth rate. The more your growth rate, the higher the capital you get.
Yep.
So the growth rate and capital are tied in. You get on this ramp. And people say, well, in Canada, we pride ourselves on capital efficiency. It doesn't work unless you've got marketing efficiency. And I can measure, because of the work I've done, I can measure marketing efficiency as well. And Shopify, really, really efficient in marketing terms. But the average firm isn't that efficient. And in fact, if you've got a pretty bad product market fit, then you're going to be inefficient, but it's still worth it to go ahead. But it just takes more money. So this gets wrapped up. And then the next part of your question was on valuation. And the funny thing is, valuation doesn't depend on where you are. It depends on how much you've raised and are raising. And that's counterintuitive, but the stats prove it out, that if you're sitting at a certain place and you raise 3 million versus raising 10 million, you're going to give away about the same percentage of your company no matter what you raise. So that you don't get more dilution from raising more money. At each stage, you get a certain amount of dilution. Let's call it 20 to 25, maybe 30% in bad terms. And no matter how much you raise, you're going to get the same dilution. So if you've got a good idea, if you've got a good market, if you've got the showings of product market fit, go out and raise as much as you can.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I like the way you broke it down into three subsections, and I'd love to double click on each of them, time permitting. One piece that you touched upon, two pieces, the valuation vis-a-vis geography, and the other one is the Canadian ecosystem, right? So let's go with the first one. Is it fair to state that in the era that we live in, potentially accelerated by lockdowns due to COVID, etc., the geographical boundaries don't play constraint anymore when it comes to entrepreneurs raising money? Less so as far as the market is concerned, but is it fair to state that an entrepreneur sitting in Toronto can now very easily reach out to someone in the Bay Area who then says, hey, listen, if you flip, come over to California, here's the check, market's much bigger, yada, yada, yada. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, totally fair. If you look at Canadian unicorns, they're substantially foreign funded.
Yep.
There were tax barriers years ago. I remember when I raised funding more than 20 years ago in Synamics, we raised almost half of our money in the U.S. And there were significant problems with doing that just because of, people weren't used to it, and there are regulatory issues and tax issues. Those are for the most part gone away, so that you don't have to worry about that. And what's happening more is that the idea of geographically focused VCs is giving way to thesis-focused VCs. And so a geographically focused VC used to operate under the presumption that they have to be able to get to a board meeting. Right. So they want to fly for a maximum of an hour, and that would be okay. You wouldn't fly across the country. You wouldn't fly to another country to go to a board meeting. Now board meetings are virtual. I mean, you're on Zoom, so it really doesn't matter. You don't have to fly anywhere. In fact, the whole world is working virtually, and it hasn't mattered. So that's gone away. There are still geographically focused venture capital funds, and I think, and I'm going to get myself beaten up by VCs on this one, I'm sure. I think that's a flawed model, because if you look at the dispersion of ideas in any local geography, you don't get usually enough volume of any one for the VC to become a specialist in the technology.
Right.
So if you look at the number of fintechs that are starting up in a particular area, you won't have the best fintechs to pick from if you are trying to do geographic-based investing. So geographic-based investing, you're taking health tech and fintech and crypto and everything under the sun. Mm-hmm. You're not going to become an expert on any one of those technologies.
All right.
Which means you can't have enough value, and you're not probably picking for the right reasons. Mm. But if you speak to a thesis-oriented fund, mm-hmm. they might have three different theses. Was that a thesis or a theses? Whatever. Theses. Yeah. They might have a few different ones, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. But the idea is they become an expert on that. They can quickly assess whether a firm is in the right ballpark, has the right idea, will fit in with what's going on in the environment. They have access to intelligent money. They can add more value on an ongoing basis. Mm-hmm. And the results of conversations are really quite different as an entrepreneur. Instead of having to educate your investor, they're actually educating you, mm-hmm. or at least confirming what they're hearing. And so in the last week, I've talked to one New York-based thesis-based investor and one Korean-based thesis mm-hmm. investor. And it's phenomenal, the input you get from those people. So, when you talk about Canada as a place, we shouldn't be investing as Canadians in Canada. Mm. We should be investing, investors are better off investing in a particular thesis, no matter where that investment is. And there are numbers of leading Canadian VCs that are actually doing that. And it's great to see, because they are the ones that are going to get the better returns in the long run. Yep. And the better returns are going to be more money, which means more money for the Canadian firms that are that they're meeting.
Which makes a ton of sense, except when the proverbial walls are written up by regulation, right? When tax implications make it difficult for the return of capital to come back into the country, I would imagine is the only reason why investors stay domiciled to geography, right? Which is a handicap, right? It shouldn't be the case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it could be that they're raising the money in that area. But if you're a fund in Toronto, why can't you raise your money in New York or Boston and keep the money domiciled there?
Yep.
It really doesn't matter, and so the returns go to Boston and New York and go back to the investors in that area.
Right.
Yeah, I use the expression, "What would you do if you lived in Buffalo?"
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know anybody who lives in Buffalo, so I hope I'm not insulting anybody. But, if you're sitting in Buffalo and you start a company, mm-hmm. where's the closest venture capital? Mm-hmm. It's in Toronto, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How many Buffalo people come to Toronto for venture capital? Mm-hmm. Where do they go? They go to New York or Boston or San Francisco, because that's where the best money is. And so I encourage people to ask the question all the time, what would you do if you lived in Buffalo? Right. You wouldn't sell into Canada. You wouldn't raise your funding in Canada. Right. You'd get your people locally to do, let's say, software development or whatever business, the technical development and operations could be local, mm-hmm. but the sales and marketing would be somewhere else. You wouldn't start a sales office in Buffalo to sell to Japan.
Right.
So, we have to be more flexible. And I think we put constraints on ourselves as Canadians on this line that exists, mm-hmm. geography. Companies rather selling to BC and Quebec mm-hmm. than selling to the US.
Yep, makes sense. And that's that's a fascinating topic in itself, right? Given the size of the Canadian market, and obviously the leaning is towards numbers defined by consumers. One of the challenges that early stage startups have is obviously the limited size of the market. And for you to garner enough traction, what would your advice be? I mean, would you think global from day one? Or would you think of attracting global investors from day one if you have a fantastic piece of IP or a piece of product that has established itself, demonstrated revenue traction in Canada, and you sort of want to appeal to a larger market like the US?
Well, in starting Dynamics, we were given bad advice. And it came from a very credible person. The person was CEO of Nortel at the time. Mm-hmm. And the expression he used was, learn to sail in your own bay before going out into the big lake.
Mm-hmm.
And, many people don't remember Nortel, but Nortel got successful because it was owned by Bell Canada, and Bell Canada bought all the switching equipment, and then it could establish a business in Canada and then go to the U.S. That didn't work for us. We tried it, and it failed, and finally we went, to hell with this. Let's go foreign. What I've learned since goes back to triggers and barriers, and I advise people not to sell first in Canada. To sell first in the market that you're going to be successful in the long run. That could be Europe. It could be Asia. It could be the U.S., whatever it is. Don't sell in Canada because you get false negatives and false positives. And so you never can prove product market fit in Canada, and you can't even prove that you'll get a second customer, because even though we speak the same language, Canadians and Americans buy differently. And you go back to triggers and what triggers Americans versus Canadians. Well, the first one is operational. Typical American companies operate in a different scale. They're much, much larger for the most part. And because of that, their solution needs are different than Canadian companies. Second fact is regulatory. They operate under a different regulatory regime, and so as a result have different inputs for what they need to purchase. Third is strategic. They have different levels of competition there. Canadian firms are oligopolistic for the most part. Look at the banks and things like that. U.S., when we were selling in Canada, there might have been 3 cellular phone providers in Toronto, but there were 7 in Los Angeles.
Wow.
So the degree of competition is much more intense. So you're going to get a different response in the U.S. to a corporate sale and into an individual sale than you do in Canada, because Canadians and the Americans buy differently. So when you start and make your first product in Canada for Canadians, chances are you're going to have to pivot once you get to the U.S. because they buy differently and for different reasons.
Right.
So this is, again, the geography thing. What would you do if you were in Buffalo? No, you wouldn't sell to Toronto first. You'd sell to New York.
Yeah.
It's what the Israelis do a really good job of. The Israelis start up companies. They build their technology there. They immediately start their sales and marketing office. In fact, there were stats I read on Boston as a place for the number of Israeli companies that have offices in Boston. It's astounding. They do it right away. They don't wait.
Well, that's fascinating, yet at the same time, not too surprising. I mean, it makes logical sense.
This is all common sense. There's nothing really earth-shattering in anything I'm doing. I'm just sort of like, when you think about it, you go, well, yeah, duh.
No, but it's exactly what you said earlier, right? It's the ability to sift through data to get to the pattern that makes it very intuitive, but then you got to get there, right? And that's, I think, what you've done remarkably well. You made a mention of oligopoly, or in this case, monopoly/duopoly. It's, I come from the telecom world. I used to work for Cisco and Juniper, 15, 20 years ago. And the beauty of what the internet was back then was that it enabled itself as a medium that democratizes supply and demand, right? And you fast forward to the players today, I think it's reasonable to say that the big 4 tech companies or the big 6 tech companies pretty much run the show. Right, but all across, right? From hardware to software to content to media to channels. And in light of that, what would be your advice to an entrepreneur starting off, I guess, anywhere in any sector, knowing that you're going to touch one of these beasts one way or the other?
That's a really hard one, because the beast can, and I know I've got one friend who runs a company that interfaces very closely with Google, and every now and then Google flips its tail and does something that completely changes his business.
Right.
And what I talk to people about is you can't be subject to a downstream strategy, meaning you can't be beholden to someone else's strategy for your revenue. I think Hootsuite is example and I don't know the exact facts here, so I could be getting things wrong and I could be criticized for it, but if memory serves me correctly, they were building their business on a certain paradigm that existed that changed, and when it changed, it really changed their business. And that's dancing with the devil. Apple, if you're subject to control of the if you're producing applications or producing apps, you're subject to their control. So I tend not to look for. I tend to steer away from businesses that it might get smashed by some small hiccup happening at Google or Apple or something like that. It's just, there's so much risk in it. There's so many other opportunities out there that are possible that get into.
Yeah, and I guess the whiplash effect, right? Like you said, in that value chain, by the time it hits you, if it's massive, you're done, right? You're doomed for failure.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
It's sort of like being in the chip business. You're going along, you're going crazy, you're going great. All of a sudden, somebody else comes with a brand new chip. Man, bang! Your business is gone instantly. It's not even a tail off. It's like you're gone.
Yeah. There's no room for a pivot there. You're done.
Yeah.
The other thing that you brought up, which is such a fascinating conversation these days, especially in Canada, is IP. Right? There's so much hot water around this topic. Most of it, at least from what I've seen, most of it is viewed through the lens of it being purely a function of technology. And number two, it being an instrument which can create jobs, and therefore it needs to be held captive within the confines of the country. What are your views on both those subtopics?
Oh, yeah. You're getting into a not fun area there because I think the obsession with IP, and I'm calling it an obsession, is misguided. And I think it is a product-focused view of technology instead of a customer-focused view of technology. And I prefer a customer-focused view of technology. And there is IP there as well. It's a different form of IP, and that's market and sales IP. I think that the companies that understand their customers very well do better than companies that understand their product very well. And you can create IP around your knowledge of a market, and that's more valuable than your IP around the ability to create a product.
Got it.
And I've got tons of examples of how this can work. But Canada has always had a technology-focused perspective. It looks at the expenditure of money on R&D and has now extended that to intellectual property as being the thing that will beat a path to the customer's, you'll beat a path to the customer's door with stronger IP. It doesn't happen. And you can take two companies with good IP and one's spending twice as much on sales and marketing, it'll have twice as much revenue. In the long run, revenue and customers are tied to expenditures on sales and marketing, not to intellectual property. You can have as much intellectual property as you want if you're not out selling it. And if it doesn't meet the customer's needs, who cares? And that's what marketing is, understanding what the customer's needs are. So in Canada, we've become obsessed with IP now, the way we used to be obsessed with technology. It is important. IP is important to a business, but in the long run, marketing and sales is at least, if not more important than ownership of intellectual property, of the technology style.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I have the luxury of having seen the rise of the startup ecosystem in a geography like India, and it's fascinating how IP, to your point, has been really has shown a light on customer centricity. Right? I mean, this country had its software services going in its favor for a couple of decades at least, but in the last 2 or 3 years, the amount of private capital that's come into the country and given birth to I believe the numbers were north of 50 unicorns in the year of the pandemic, right? And a lot of it has to do,
In India, you mean?
yeah, in India, yeah. Right. From what I read last, the likelihood of India hitting about 100 unicorns is very high in the next year or so, right? And a lot of it has to do with customer centricity and innovation on business models that are closer to the customer than to the tech or to the product, right?
Yeah.
And I guess the combination of the two is really what makes it incredibly powerful. And I guess time will tell if we'll get there collectively as a race.
Yeah. The funny thing is, you can have really great sales and marketing and lousy product and be successful.
Right.
What type of computer are you using?
Yeah, right now I have a Surface.
Which is so are you using Windows
Yeah.
operating system?
Windows. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm on a Mac. Well, arguably, who has the better technology?
Oh, clearly you do.
I mean, yeah, thank you very much for that. But Microsoft knows how to sell.
Oh, that's true. That's right. Yeah, that's a great point. Right. What trumps the other? Sales versus.
And look at the iPhone versus the BlackBerry. Which was better technology? And Apple really wiped out the BlackBerry. They had lots of intellectual property. I mean, beautiful. The keyboard, I still prefer the BlackBerry keyboard. I can't type quickly on an iPhone, but there are no more BlackBerries, are there? Because Apple is more customer centric than BlackBerry.
Yep, absolutely. Yep, I agree. In fact, on that note, I was thinking, I was in the Bay Area last month, and the peak of COVID, it was impossible to get testing done, and I had to catch an aircraft to head out of the country, and you needed to do an RT-PCR from pre-specified labs, etc. And it boiled down to these two constraints, right? One is the price, and the other is the availability of testing, and both had bottlenecks. And I ended up spending, for my family of three, about close to $200 per person to be able to. Yeah, and it was impossible, right? I had to drive 30 miles or thereabouts to get an RT-PCR test. And I get into India, and I guess it's attributable to volumes, and therefore margins can be low because you have enough of a customer base. Talk about customer centricity. I can get on an app, hit a button. A person shows up at home in a PPE kit. He does an RT-PCR test. You'll get the results on email, and the whole thing costs $8. And you're done.
Yeah.
It's customer centricity, right?
Yeah. Now, you could be sitting in that same office in San Francisco and order gummies or anything to toke, and it'd be brought to your door in minutes. I mean, the whole weed industry was customer centric, and it's fascinating to see the difference. Yeah. You've got a marijuana industry that's customer centric, and a testing industry that's product or technology centric, and you can see the difference on a daily basis.
Right, exactly. I mean, I guess the counter argument could be, one, playing devil's advocate, one is public health and safety, and the other is wellness, preventive.
Who knows? Yeah. Who knows which is which? But
that's right. On that note, switching topics, right? The pandemic created lockdowns, of course, and saw a bunch of people working remotely. And now we see a wave of people either coming back to work or sort of redefining the way they work. Given what you've seen, not just the pandemic, but your experience of having been in the ecosystem, how important is the concept of social capital, if you will, to build those relationships, and therefore the importance of being in office in person?
Well, being in person, whether it's in your office or somebody else's office, if you think of design thinking, part of design thinking is actually watching how people handle technology. But you can't watch them if you're sitting in another room. So innovation happens at the intersection of various things. And that happens when people are getting together. It doesn't happen on Zoom.
Yep.
And so I think the tech industry, there will be lots of people who can continue to work at home because they aren't part of innovating. They're part of executing someone else's innovation.
Right.
But the people who need to innovate, who need to get to understand customers and will be live and in the office. It's the casual conversations that result in it's the intersection of different perspectives and different people, different problems that give rise to innovative solutions. And you don't have that without the collisions. So that degree of interactivity, I think, is critical in the long run. And I think people realize that. And people miss it. You spend all day sitting on Zoom hour by hour, but you miss all of the random chats that might solve things in 5 seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I personally do miss, or flipping it around, when you get into a Zoom conversation, you pretty much automatically flip that switch that gets into meeting mode, right? There's no 5-minute mentor, like you said. And I wonder how much is lost when we don't do that.
And I feel sorry for the people who spend their whole day in Zoom meetings. That must be a horrible chore.
You're looking at one of them.
I don't do it often enough that it bothers me.
Yeah. I was just joking that you're potentially looking at one of them, Charles.
Yeah. Oh, really?
No, it's not that bad. But zooming into work is clearly as remote as it could be, given that I'm on the other side of the planet, but potentially not for long. So.
Yeah.
Another interesting topic that you and I scratched the surface on offline before the podcast was the desire and your ability to wet your toes into ranking VCs. Can you? I would love for you to sort of unravel that.
Well, I haven't done it yet because I'm afraid what the reaction would be. For 6 years now, I've ranked companies. And I developed over time a ranking methodology to allow me to see what was going on. And I've got data going back 5 years in the same format. So I'll come out later this year with a piece that looks at the last 5 years. And I can see the movement and changes in the Canadian ecosystem just as I look at this Narwhal list. And the new Narwhal list is ready. It'll come out in the next week or two.
Nice.
And I've been looking at that, and it's really phenomenal how well we have progressed. And I can actually measure our progression year by year. And that's what's critical. I can measure one company against another over time and in various different, and you can use that to make decisions. So I tried that last year with accelerators, and I built a model for measuring the results of accelerators. And I used the perspective of an entrepreneur going into an accelerator. Not the returns that the accelerator might have earned, because I have no way of getting those. And there might be some that I've given poor ratings to that have earned incredible amounts of money. Doesn't matter. I'm looking at and they could have done that just through one company. So they have one success and 99 failures, and the one success make up for the 99. And they've done well. That's not what I'm looking at. I'm looking from an entrepreneur's perspective, which is, can I make progress as a result of that? So based on that, I got some interesting feedback, some positive and some negative. Some people whose feelings were hurt. And this is interesting because I'm using data. And the fact that people's feelings were hurt from my use of data, I find a little confusing, because data is data and it's not feelings. And if you want to feel better about yourself, then get your results better. But that is challenging to people who have not been rated before. So now I face the ability, and I've worked on this for a number of years, to how I can rate venture capitalists. And I'm not sure if I want to or not, because I'm not sure how many people are going to get pissed off. And that's a sad dynamic in itself, to think that I might be pissing people off by rating them. What I want to do is be able to rate their ability to pick winners. And I can define what a winner is. I can measure whether they picked winners or not. and so I can see which ones in Canada at a certain stage, because you can't take a Series B investor like Georgian or Omers and compare them to a pre-seed or seed investor or a Series A investor like Real Ventures. It's just comparing apples and oranges. But what you can do is you can look at all the pre-seeds or all the seeds and say, who were the best investors in seed rounds? Now, that's going to fly in the face of people's own perceptions about themselves. And what I'm worried about is if I bring out something like that any of the companies that I'm working with are going to get shunned by the venture capitalists on the rating system. So I do that with a bit of hesitation. If I've got my guts with me, I might actually do it and see what happens.
At minimum, it gives you and I an opportunity to catch up in person, building social capital over coffee, so I can look at that.
Yeah, look at the list.
That's right.
And see where people are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In your ranking of accelerators, right, there were these metrics that I absolutely fell in love with, and I'm finessing for the ability to put together a small pool of capital that we can allocate to some of the startups that go through our program, right? So you spoke a little bit about graduation rate, the financial velocity benchmarked against, I think it was the median/average, and the percentage of high velocity. How did you come up with those particular metrics?
Well, first of all, I was looking for metrics that are easy for me to acquire. So when I do the Narwhal list, I have two sources for metrics. One is Crunchbase and the other is LinkedIn. And using LinkedIn, I can go and look at each company and how many employees it had 2 years ago and how many it has now as a proxy for growth. I've tested it against real growth rates. It is directionally correct, which means that I'm okay with it. But when it came down to looking at all of the accelerators, I had to look at each investment made by every accelerator. And so if I had to acquire the LinkedIn data, it was going to take me days and days and days. And I didn't have the time. So I just went with anything I could get from Crunchbase, which is why financial velocity was possible. Financial velocity I've also checked as a number, and it is it's simply the amount of capital that's been raised over time. And so it's capital divided by years in existence. And the more you raise, the faster your higher financial velocity. And I can show the pattern of financial velocity of all companies. And you can see the good performing companies have a velocity at least of 10 or more. And so I can measure very easily the financial velocity of all of the companies that went through all of the accelerator programs in 25 US accelerators and all the Canadian ones, very simply. So that part of it was the ease of being able to do the calculation. Secondly, that enables anybody else to do the calculation too. I've explained the methodology, and if somebody wants more details, they can come and ask me and undertake it themselves. But the idea is behind metrics is, do you have something, is the metric correlated with success? And I've done testing that shows that the metric is correlated with success. Thereby, how are we doing and what can we do to increase our levels of success? So an accelerator can become better at picking companies. It can make sure that the companies acquire more capital, and it can create more winners. So it actually provides direction for the operations of an organization if you have good metrics. If you've got bad metrics, which is total dollar amount raised, well, that's a metric that many of the accelerators use. So our companies have raised 1.6 billion. Well, one of them raised 1.5 billion and the other 100 raised 100 million. That's meaningless. It's pervert statistics. So what I'm looking for is medians and thresholds and things like that, just to make a meaningful metric. And I know it's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's how I came up with it.
No, it's a fantastic, all-encompassing metric that captures not just the anomalies, right? It also captures the stuff in the middle. One thing that I would love to get your opinion on is measurement of ecosystems, right? If you talk to the two drivers of ecosystems. One, arguably, is the folks with capital, the VCs, and they're in it for the home runs, right? They're really not in it for the doubles and the triples,
average.
right?
Yeah.
The averages, yeah. And then on the other side, you have accelerators, arguably quite a few of them underwritten by tax dollars, whose objective is to create jobs. Now, so you could argue that on one side there is the professing of blitzscaling hypergrowth, and on the other side there's potentially the professing of, maybe for the lack of a better word, bootstrapping. Is there a way to, and you need both, right? Is there a way by which you can measure the success of an ecosystem by taking both those players into account?
Well, I might be raining on your parade here, but there's a lot of economic analysis that says that creating mid-sized companies is not the best thing for the economy. The best thing for the economy is to create super large companies. There are a number of reasons for that. Typically, the larger companies have higher revenue per employee. They pay more, so the jobs are better. They have hire more people. And I've done some of the economic analysis that shows that companies that have more Global 2000 companies within them, the countries that have more Global 2000 companies in them actually perform better economically than countries with fewer ones, which means the countries that are going after the mid-sized winners do not perform as well economically as the ones that generate the huge companies. So, from an economic standpoint, depending upon what your objective is for success, and most people say GDP is the measure of success. I would argue that GDP is a bad measure for success, but if it's GDP per person you want, then you're better off with very few, very huge companies that are inordinately successful around the world than a whole bunch of medium-sized ones.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it brings it down to outsized returns and the benefit of those outsized returns that has a flow through into the rest of the economy. Yeah, makes sense.
Well, you can see it now, what's happening in Shopify. People are the employees of Shopify are cashing in, and they're now reinvesting.
Right. Yep.
And that happens every time that there's success in a market, that the reinvestment occurs, and as a result, the whole is better off. You don't get that same level of reinvestment when somebody has sold a company for $20 million.
Right.
$20 million is enough to live well, very well, but $200 million is enough to invest $20 million in all sorts of random little companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the difference you get, and why one of the reasons bigger companies are better for the economy.
Fantastic. I know you and I can go on, Charles. At least I can, because it's fascinating listening to you. But unfortunately, we're running out of time. And on a parting note, if you were to give a piece of advice to entrepreneurs in our ecosystem in Canada, what would that be?
Go big or go home. Go for big markets, and wherever those are, ignore small markets. Go for big capital. Go for big solutions for big customers, and I think that's the route, or big numbers of customers. It's don't be hesitant to really throw it all out there to become huge, because if you've got a good idea, someone else will do it if you don't.
Right. Spot on. Charles, it's been a fantastic 1 hour. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Hopefully we'll get you back here, your bandwidth permitting.
It's been fun.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Thank you so much again. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
And look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you, Charles.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Waterloo Grid is sponsored by the David Johnston Research and Technology Park. Our show is edited, produced, and managed by BlueMax.